Good morning, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started, and we'll let people join as they come in, as we keep populating and the navigation series today. As you all know, since you signed up for it, today we are talking about finances, and it seems maybe this should have been the first one that we did. I don't know. But it is definitely the one we are doing today. So thank you all for joining and spending a little bit of your time with us this morning. So I really wanted to get started today by just saying thank you to all of you. When we started this as an idea, it actually came to, it really wasn't, we shouldn't get all the authorship responsibility or credit for this. This actually came because people in the nonprofit community who are my friends, who came and asked what we were thinking, what the Midwest Center was thinking, what I was thinking about some of these different topics. And so they really were the ones with the idea. And in a staff meeting at the Midwest Center, I threw out the idea of doing these. Like, let's just get online with Zoom and make it free. I don't know about how all of you feel, but I can tell you that one of the ways I feel on a regular basis right now is pretty helpless. And I don't have a lot of skill sets, so I was relatively limited on what I can do. I can't show up at an emergency room and help someone there. Unfortunately, I'm not that kind of doctor. I can be a father, I can be a husband, but I thought, I felt like I needed to help in some way, and so this was the spirit behind why we were doing these. And so I want to say thank you, because if it was just me and Cindy and Monica and Dave and Mark talking on here and not you all engaging with us, it wouldn't be the same experience for us. And so we are eternally grateful that the nonprofit community continues to support us. And I thought it was appropriate to kind of kick off the last of the series of three, the first series of three with this, with just a thank you from us at the Midwest Center and me personally, because this has really been something that I've looked forward to every week as we kind of go through this process, and that I've learned so much from all of you. And I'm just very grateful that you continue to let me be of some degree of assistance to you as you kind of navigate through this process. So it means a great deal to me. So I'm a bit of a crier, as my wife could chime in and tell you, so I'm going to stop now before the waterworks get going here. So so thank you. The other thing that I kind of wanted to mention at the top before I get into content is that we have more coming. Yes, JP, I'm moving on from the sappiness. We have more of these coming, and they'll be every Tuesday. We're going to continue to do this every Tuesday at 8:30 while this crisis is going on, but we're going to continue to do it after the crisis. One of the things we try and do is practice what we preach. And in the very first session of this, we talked about getting narrow, strategically invest in the core, innovate in the core. This is one of our ways that we're practicing that at the Midwest Center. So these will go on indefinitely. And I'm excited to tell you that out of the next three, I will only be doing one of them. I'm only excited to tell you that because you're probably getting tired of hearing my perspective. But my colleague, Dave Renz, is going to be doing a session on strategic governance in times like this, and then he's also going to do one on change management in times like this, and change management is applicable, and so is strategic governance in any environment. And then I'm going to come back and we're going to talk more about prototyping as a tool for innovation, right? So we've kind of really laid out broad strokes. We've kind of been at the 20,000 foot level so far, but as we keep these moving and rotating through topic wise, our next several are going to continue to be, that Dave's going to do, are going to be at a fairly high level, especially the governance. Then we're going to come down and it's going to get a little more tactical, strategically tactical. And then I'm going to be kind of in the weeds with you looking at prototyping. As many of you who know me know, design thinking is something I practice on a regular basis with organizations. And so there will be a design thinking theme to a lot of the stuff I do with you moving forward. And so I'm very excited to announce our next three. There will be links out, and we will email everybody about those just like we have previously. So please sign up for those. Tell your friends about these. Again, there's no intention to ever charge for these. We just think it's so critically important for the nonprofit community to have a space to think about these kind of topics and challenge themselves and challenge each other and challenge us at the Midwest Center. So your chats and your comments mean so very much to us, and we keep paying attention and trying to get better. So we hope that we will continue to get better. We know we will try to, at least. The other thing I wanted to just congratulate you all on is the university is launching a variety of these. There's not been a response to what we're doing at the university that has even come close to paralleling what you all have done in the nonprofit sector. The fact that right now there are 135 people on here at a little after 8:30 in the morning getting ready to talk about finance is a credit to the nonprofit sector. And I always tell my colleagues, those who haven't worked with nonprofits and worked with professionals in the nonprofit sector have been selling themselves short their entire career, because there's no greater group of professionals than the nonprofit professionals that I've gotten to spend the last 20 years of my career with. So again, thank you all. Couldn't be happier to be here with you all this morning. So enough of the sappiness. Let's talk finance, because that'll be sure to cure up any anxiety that anybody has, or any degree of emotion that anybody has, or at least change the emotion to a different one. So here are the three things I'm looking at right now. For those of you who don't know my background, I've spent the majority of my adult life studying two things, nonprofits and economics, which proves a couple of things. One, I am a bit of a nerd. And two, that this is actually a topic that I am extremely passionate about. And when I think of economics, I often think about it in the perspective of how it actually affects the decisions we make. That's what's most interesting to me about economics, and particularly finance. And so this isn't an accounting discussion. I'm not an accountant. There are talented accountants out there that you could talk to. I know Christy Cubbage is on here, who works with Support Kansas City. They're very talented. So shout out to our colleague over there. But there are things from a financial leadership that really fit within that economics model. And the three things in this time right now, as we deal with COVID-19, as we deal with the economic downturns, that I'm particularly looking at as it relates to nonprofit organizations and any organization that's talking to me right now. And those three things are capital structure, marginal cost versus marginal revenue. And my wife told me I had to explain that in greater detail, so I will, trust me, as we get a little further into that. And the third is total versus direct costs. So let's dig in first with capital structure, which I think is as important of a topic as you can have in financial leadership of any organization, for profit or a nonprofit. Because what capital structure is principally concerned with is the way that your resources are organized. And when I say organized, the way that you have your resources, or the decisions you've made that led to the organization of your resources in these three critical areas, in the areas of assets, debt, and equity. And equity is not a good word in the nonprofit sector. It doesn't really have an applicable parallel. So let me talk through these very quickly with you. When I talk about assets, we're talking about the things that you own, right? Buildings. We're talking about endowments or long-term restricted funds. Oftentimes when we talk about assets, we're talking about, what in accounting they say PPE, which is different than the COVID PPE, but it's plants, property, and equipment. The other asset that we care probably most about, and in times like this are critically important, is cash, right? Cash is king almost always, but it's particularly important right now. What your capital structure will help you figure out is how much flexibility and latitude you have to either preserve cash or access more cash, right? So what we're not just interested in taking an accounting of what we have asset-wise, debt-wise, and equity-wise. And when we say equity in the nonprofit sector, we're going to call that net assets, right? What we have, what we're worth, what our organization's worth. But what we're really interested in is the relationships between these, right? So it's okay to have debt or be leveraged as long as that leverage isn't too much as it relates to the number of assets we have, right? So we want the level of debt to be relatively low compared to our level of assets. And the greater the spread, so the more assets, the greater the difference between assets and debt, the greater flexibility we would have in a time like this. So if, for example, right now, I had $1 million of debt and $1 million of assets, that's not a great situation for thinking about how much liquidity I have. Because I've already leveraged basically every dollar of my assets for every dollar in the form of debt, right? So the collateral is equal. As it relates to net assets, what's critically important in this space are those assets that are the value of what we're worth that isn't restricted, right? So when you think about a nonprofit's financials, in net assets, we would break that down into 3 levels: unrestricted, and actually it's 2 levels now. I think it's unrestricted and restricted, temporarily or permanently. What we really care about right now is that level that is unrestricted, right? Because that's our level that is going to be that's going to be the level that we have right now that gives us our freedom of movement, our ability to innovate if we go back to the very first session, or more importantly, just the ability to cover payroll, so the ability to keep offering programming as donations may be stalled right now, or foundations have reprioritized where they're spending their money for good reason. So this relationship, this graphic, which shows the relationship between our assets, our debt, and our equity, is critically important right now. And we want to be monitoring it. And we want to understand within the unique context of our own organizations how that's impacting us, right? So if I need to, A, set a projection on what I want the relationship to be between these 3, and then B, follow up to assess where am I in that relationship. So really pretty slide here, but this essentially is a tutorial, a brief kind of cheat sheet on and yeah, Dave, I'll come back and repeat the definition of equity as it pertains to nonprofits. I can do it within the context of this slide. So how do you go about using the information that's readily available to you, or ideally would be readily available to you, to examine capital structure in your organization? And before I go through these ratios real quick, let me, again, equity as it relates to a nonprofit, quite simply, is we call net assets. And all it really is the number of assets you have minus the liabilities you have, which would equal your equity or net assets. But what we really care about in that number in the nonprofit sector, and this is radically different than the for-profit sector because it doesn't have a parallel with for-profits, is the unrestricted net asset balance. And the unrestricted net asset balance is critically important to us because that's the actual money we have available for discretionary purposes. If it's restricted, it's not just money, sometimes it's assets that are available for discretionary purposes. If it's restricted, then it has either a use or a time restriction on it. Okay? So when we think about restrictions, I want to say something very clear. If you own a building, a building is unrestricted as soon as you build it. Almost always, especially if you've done it through a capital campaign. So a building is an unrestricted asset. So the percent of your building that's in that net assets is unrestricted dollars for you. So obviously it's not liquid, but it is unrestricted. And when I say liquid, I mean able to be used currently, immediately. So here are 3 ratios that I want to give you that I'm paying particular attention to. And I did create a worksheet that's available in Box that Mark sent out. And all of these are in there. And the specifics of these, number one thing everybody's looking at right now, and I hope all of you are looking at, is how many days of cash on hand do I have? And all this equation is saying is, how much cash do I have? I'm going to add that to my marketable securities, investments, whatever you call it on your balance sheet. And I want to divide that by what is my average daily expenses. And if I take my cash and marketable securities and divide it by what my daily expenses are, then I'm going to know how many days I could keep operating if I didn't receive an additional dollar of revenue. Okay? My fixed asset turnover, this is this piece where I'm talking about the value of your dollars right now, specifically the value of your fixed assets, like your buildings. And what I'm looking at here is how much revenue are my buildings or my other fixed assets generating for me. And then finally, my debt ratio. And this is that leverage piece. Sometimes these are called leverage ratios. And what I'm looking at here is how much total debt do I have as it relates to total assets? Remember I said, what's the parallel going on? These are the three indicators I'm looking at from a capital structure perspective. So, capital structure we've talked about. Now, let's get into our second thing that I'm looking at, marginal revenue versus marginal cost. Right? In the for-profit sector, the economists will tell you, accountants will tell you, you're always going to provide service as long as your marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost. I'll define those for you. Marginal revenue is the additional unit, is the amount of revenue you receive for providing an additional unit of service. So if I give you an example of the university, every time we add a student, what is our additional revenue that we get for providing education to that student? So if it's $500 a credit hour for a grad student, then every time a student signs up for another credit hour, we get $500. That's our marginal revenue. Our marginal cost is, what is the additional cost we incur for educating that additional student, right? And we're going to figure that out by adding up all the variable costs that are associated with it. And I know it's early in the morning to be throwing these words around, so I apologize for that, but it is important. And when we talk about variable costs, what we're differentiating here are things like supplies, books, food, anything that's additional student would consume as part of the education process and that we're required to provide. This is different than our fixed costs, which don't change throughout the course of our service, no matter how many students we provide. Think salaries, teacher salaries, administrative salaries, utilities, rent. They're the same no matter what. Right? So in the for-profit sector, we always make the decision to keep providing services as long as our marginal revenue exceeds our marginal cost. In the nonprofit sector, marginal revenue never, ever is greater than marginal cost. I shouldn't say never, ever, but almost never, ever. Right? You may be fortunate enough to have a social enterprise that is essentially a for-profit activity where your marginal revenue is greater than your marginal cost. But for the 139 people on here right now, let's be honest, most of the time that doesn't happen. So why am I paying attention to this if it doesn't happen? I'm not paying attention to it for the production or the producing function that I mentioned earlier, like in the for-profit sector. I'm actually paying attention to it because I need to know how much additional levels of service I can provide right now. And based on my ability to raise money through fundraising or through other sources to cover whatever the gap is between my marginal cost and my marginal revenue. Let me make this very simple. If my marginal cost is $2 to provide to educate another student, and my marginal revenue, what they pay, is $1, I have a gap of $1. So for every additional student I'm going to educate, I need to raise, probably philanthropically, another $1 to just stay at break even. You can do this with grants, right? If I know that I get $100,000 to educate students, then how many students can I educate for that $100,000 based on this marginal revenue, marginal cost? Additional students can I, based on this equation. But oftentimes right now, in times like this, many nonprofits are forced to serve more people. This marginal revenue, marginal cost relationship is critically important because this will tell you how many more people you can serve based on your ability to raise additional dollars through other sources. And so what we also want to do in this space by looking at marginal revenue and marginal cost is we want to cut our losses. If there is we want to be paying very close attention to this relationship so that we can ensure that we don't just, I was going to say erroneously take on more service delivery than our philanthropic function can keep up with during this time. Very, very critical point. And I know it's a very difficult thing in the nonprofit space because our mission is to serve people, but we can't serve people to the point where we actually make ourselves no longer a going concern. Right? So now we're in the weeds from the strategy piece up above, right, that we talked about in our very first session together. We have something popping up in the chat, so I'm going to take a quick look to see what it is. Oh, thanks, Cindy. Finally, this came up. I wasn't even going to talk about this, but it came up in the very first session that we did, and it's true program costs. Because what I talked about is cutting the fringe and innovating in the core. And somebody said, well, what if our fringe makes us money? And I said, does it make you revenue or does it make you profit? And what that really comes to is a relationship that exists between what is the real amount of resources that you're spending in each program, and what are the real amount of resources that you are bringing in each program. And one of the hard decisions that you all may have to make during this time, and I really hope you don't have to in areas that are critical to you and your mission, is what programs may we have to cut or suspend in order to save cash right now. And the reason that this true program cost or total cost versus direct cost is important is if you look at the inner circles of this slide, these aren't going away if you cut a program, right? If you cut, let's say, if I cut one of my education programs, my salary doesn't get cut. My colleagues' salaries don't get cut. What does get cut are maybe the teachers in that program, the book costs in that program, some of those kind of things. So if a program, let's say the total cost of a program is $100,000, but I have overhead costs that are 20% of that total cost, meaning so 20% of, so 20,000 of that 100,000 is overhead. If I cut that program, I'm only saving $80,000. I don't save the full $100,000. So this relationship that exists between your total program costs and your direct program costs is really important to understand. And so one of the things that we did for this session was I created a worksheet, and it's really not important for the discussion you're getting ready to have, but it is potentially valuable for you as you leave this session and go back to your organizations. And in the first box on the worksheet that you have, I set up a bunch of kind of lines to fill out that are related to capital structure, the upper left-hand corner box, right? What are your days of cash on hand? What are your short-term assets? Your short-term assets, what are your short-term debts? What are your long-term debts? Your short-term debts are just the ones you're going to owe sooner versus your long-term debts are the ones you owe more than a year out. What are your total debts? What are your assets? What's the difference between those two things? And then what's your calculation of the ratios I presented earlier? And again, you have the slides in box also for those ratios. I then have a box in the upper right-hand side that looks at your marginal revenue, marginal cost. And what I did with that box was I said, what is your, for multiple programs, so do it program by program by program. What are your marginal costs and your marginal revenues for each of those programs? And if you subtract those two things, if you subtract marginal revenue from marginal cost, what you'll actually get is the amount you have to raise in support. So when I say support, I'm talking about donations versus revenue when I'm talking about fees for service, program fees, is the amount you'll have to support for each additional unit. And then you can project out what your additional units served will be. And you can get to a whole number of what your fundraising goal would be for that program right now, depending on demand and things like that. The last box is this total program cost. And I tried to make it I tried to use a language that I thought might be applicable across the entire constituency of your organizations. And so I frame them as costs that stay versus costs that go. What are all the costs that, no matter whether you cut programming or not, are going to still be there, right? Your executive director, your finance, your overhead costs, your building, your rent, things like that. Versus if you cut a program, what are the direct costs of that program that would go away if you actually cut that program? And that's the box in the bottom that's kind of shaped like a L that's laying on its back. And again, the purpose of this is just simply to hopefully provide you with a tool that you could use to, if you fill it out, then you could have discussions with your board, with other staff, with your strategy team on how you're going to continue to navigate this area and monitor what's going on financially in your organization. I can't emphasize enough, though, that it's not just enough to monitor. You also should have goals, financial goals, for how you're going to navigate the current situation that we're in now. So as we move to the last two slides here, what I really want to do is, Monica, if you don't mind putting everybody into the breakout groups, I'm particularly interested in what are the conversation point that you all should be having as you move into these groups. What are the financial indicators? What financial indicators are specifically important to your organization? So I gave you the three I'm looking at, which I think are broadly applicable, but it's also useful to begin to have a conversation right now about what's particularly important to your given situation, because there are going to be variances based on the sector and the type of work that you do. Okay, so I'm going to pause, partly because it'll allow me a specific space to break this video, and Monica should be putting you all into your groups as we speak.